So this is kind of like, I just made this iteration because there's very frequently is, and this is what you guys are probably going to animate is, not this, but the walking sphere. So it's essentially like a really basic early animation kind of exercise. Is that it's just a sphere with some legs, so you can practice doing walking and stuff like that without actually having to worry about, you know, arms and head. And it's just like kind of like breaking you guys in. But we're going to be rigging this because it's simple, right? We're just going to be really worrying about like one area of locomotion. We're not going to worry about a head. We're not going to be worrying about an arm. We're not going to worry about the spine. We're just going to be kind of getting a basic rig that's going to work. Okay? What we're going to do is we have our geometry, and as we're going along, we're going to try to name things properly, but we have things named based on left and right. So you can see I have left side, right side, and I have _R and _L, right? So that's our geometry. And this is what we got from our animator, our modeler. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to want to go in and make sure that these guys do not have any history to them. So it looks like they don't, but just to be safe, usually before you start modeling or rigging, you want to go ahead and delete your history. So to do that, you go to Edit, Delete All by Type, History, or Non-Deformer History. We'll do History. Reason why you want to do that is we talked about this a couple of times about modeling, but with modeling, if we delete our history because there's a chance for corruption, it's the same thing with this situation, right? We want to make sure there's not going to be any corruption on anything. The other thing we want to do is we want to make sure that our transform values on all of our assets are 0 or 1. So scale should be 1, right? You don't want scale to be 0 because then the thing stops existing. And then translate and rotate 0 values just means this is its neutral position. This is where its default position should be. You're telling Maya, hey, this is where it should be. So what we're going to do is we're also going to select all our geometry. We're going to go to Modify, Freeze Transformations. What that'll do is it'll just set whatever, like if I scale this up, you can see if I scale it up and maybe move it up, you'll see it has transform values, non-zero, non-1. And if I go up and do Modify, Freeze Transformations, it'll set those to 0 and 1, which is essentially telling Maya, hey, this is the default size I want it to be, or default pose I want it to be. Because if I don't, then this is kind of telling Maya, hey, this object, this isn't its default position or size. It's been moved up and scaled up a little bit, which, to you guys, you might be like, well, I'm not going to set it back to 1, who cares? But it's just clean that if you want this to be the actual size and position and you want to lock it, then you just go ahead and freeze all. You can right click also in the channel box and right click and say freeze transformations all. Okay. I'm not going to scale it up. I'm going to go back to here. Okay, so our geometry has been cleaned up. We've gotten rid of our history. We've frozen our transformations. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select my geometry and I'm going to go ahead and put it in a layer. So we're going to go to the channel box. We're going to come down to the display layers down here. We're going to click on this layers button. And we're going to say create layer from selected. What it's going to do is it's going to create a new layer with our geometry added to it. And then I'm just going to go ahead and click on that third little button until it says R. And so now it's in reference mode. So now I won't be able to select my geometry while I'm working, which is just kind of nice. We'll unreference it in a little bit when we need to kind of like mess around with the geometry. But for now, we just want this as kind of like a reference because we're going to be the first step is always cleanup, right, with our geometry. The second step is going to be building our joint structure or our skeleton of our rig. Okay. So in order to do this for the building the joint structure, what we're going to do is we're going to let's come over here. We are going to be using, I'm coming to the rigging menu set or the hotbar, shelf, whatever you call it, shelf, I think it's shelf bar. And then we're going to use the second button here, which is the create joints. We can also come over to the rigging menu set and we can come over to skeleton, create joints, okay? So you'll see when I'm just going to do this off the model for a second, but you'll see when I start clicking and dragging, I'm dropping in a new joint, right? And so this joint is, just like a point in space that will bind a skin to, and this is going to be where it's going to rotate around. Okay. I'm going to select that. I'm going to, with that create joint tool selected, I'm going to click on that joint again, and I'm going to go ahead and click over here, and you'll see it's kind of hard to see. So let's go ahead and go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Color Settings, 3D Views. Let's change that background. so you guys can maybe see it again a little bit better. All right. So I dropped a second joint, and you'll see it went ahead, and this feels a little funky, but let me go ahead and show you guys. I'll delete that those joints for a second. So I'll drop a joint here. I'll unselect that joint, and then I'll come back in and I'll drop in a new joint. Right? So you'll see both of these joints are separate from each other. Right? They're not having any impact on one another. That's cool. If I have this create joint tool selected and I click on a joint and then add a new joint, what it's going to do is it's automatically going to parent them together, right? So it actually is going ahead and creating a joint chain, right? So these joints all have a relationship to each other. We have a parent-child relationship with this arrow showing the relationship between a parent and a child, right? Pointing from the parent down to the child. Right? This is something that you just need to keep in mind when you're working with the joint tool. Is that, you know, when you're clicking, or if you have an active joint selected and you're using this create joint tool, it's going to automatically parent them together in a parent-child relationship. Which sometimes, a lot of times you kind of want, and we're going to use that. But sometimes you'll be like, oh, no, I don't want those. There's another thing that you need to keep in mind is you'll see this little arrow structure thing right here. Or it's like a little mini, what's it called? Orientation. So we have our Y up, Z forward, X left and right. When I click on here, you can kind of see like the direction of those little circles on the original joint. Don't look at the new joint, look at the original joint. You'll see the direction of those circles. When I click and drag and drop a new joint, you'll see it rotates to point towards that joint. This is what's called joint orientation. This is essentially saying which direction that joint is facing. And generally speaking, it's going to be facing what's called down the bone, which means that it's facing its child, right? It rotates to look at the child. And if I come in here, you'll see the rotation controls for it is oriented to that little orientation system if I'm using object mode. If I go to world mode, of course, it's going to have world orientation. But this is probably one of the, we're going to try to build this as much as possible without you guys getting too bogged down in like us having to back up and explain like underlying principles and things. But you'll see, even though this is rotated away from the world, right? So here's the world, or here's object, here's the world. We don't have any rotation values, right? We instead have orientation values, or let's see, where is it? Joint orientation. So right here, if I go down to joint orientation, it's essentially an underlying way of telling the joint in Maya, like, hey, I'm facing a particular direction, but I don't have any rotation values on it for the purposes of, you know, transformations inside of here. So just keep that in mind. It's not going to be, we're not getting so far into this that you guys are going to have to worry about this stuff too much. And we're building such a simple skeleton that we're not going to have to worry about it. But it's just another thing you have to keep in mind, right? Okay, so we're going to come back out here. All right, so we have our character. I'm going to be using this 4-panel layout. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. I'm going to be switching between them. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to the side view. And we're going to be using, we'll take a look at this out here first. The first thing we're going to determine is where our base joint is, or our root joint. This is going to be the ultimate, so like there has to be a single parent, right? For everything, right? Something that is controlling everything else. So for instance, for my geometry, the single parent is this group it's under, right? So everything's underneath this group. This would be called like the root or the base kind of parent. We're going to do the same thing with our joint structure. We're going to choose a point where it's like our origin of the entire body. And I don't want us to get too far into this, but essentially speaking, or I don't know what I'm trying to say, but essentially what we want is we want to determine where our rig or our skeleton starts. For biped characters, just to simplify this, it's generally going to be the base of the spine or the hips, okay? So it's essentially around the hip area, right? Because then you're having the legs go down one way and the upper body going up the other way. And usually the way I think of it is like, if you want to have two different areas of the body that are kind of like moving independent of each other most frequently, that's where you, that kind of boundary between those two different areas that move separately from each other is where that root joint is. So if I'm going to be like, you can sit down on the ground, like on your butt, and you can move your legs around, right? And it's not going to move your upper body. And similarly speaking, you can stand up and you can bend your upper body around and move around, and it's not going to move your legs, right? So your legs and your upper body, even though your legs move your upper body when you walk, generally speaking, your legs and your upper body are separate from each other. And so we're finding that area between the upper body and the legs that is kind of like, you know, where their boundary is, where, yeah, they're separated from each other. So that's going to be the hip area. So this is where my hips are on this character. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over to the side view. And the reason why I want to come to the side view, I'll show you. If I drop in a joint here, let's go. If I can't even hit the ground, it won't even let me drop a joint, but let's look at it from above, right? So I'll drop in, I'm like, okay, cool. It looks like it's on the, maybe it's on the surface of the character, or maybe it's right here. I rotate, oh, no, it's dropping it on the ground. That's weird. So generally speaking, when you drop in new joints, you don't really want to do it from the perspective view because of the way that Maya automatically tries to figure out where your joints are supposed to be. So we usually do it from the side, front, or top views. So I'm going to come over to the side view. And the reason why I'm doing the side view is because I want this to kind of be right in the center of my character. I could do it from the front view, but you'll see when I drop it in, it's not so easy to get it right in the middle. So if I want it to be right in the middle, I usually do it from here. We'll see both of these at the same time. If I do it from the side, you'll see that no matter where I put it in the side, it's going to be right in the center of my character because my character is aligned with the center of the world. So it's kind of like there's like a flat plane cutting the character in half that the joint is being snapped to. And if I'm doing it from the front, there's like a flat plane going through the character this way that the joint is being snapped to. So you can see when I move this up, no matter where I move this up and down, left and right, it has the same depth. It's actually further back than I thought it would be. I thought it would just line up right with the middle of the world. It's kind of weird. Anyways, okay. So we'll come over to the side view and we're going to drop in that main root joint. What is going on? When did that happen? Now it's no longer in the center. That's so strange. I'm sure I'm doing something wrong. There we go. Okay, whatever. So we're going to kind of get this a little bit center of mass. So we'll put it like right around here. This is our first joint. So this is kind of important. We want our joint this base joint to just kind of be neutral. We don't want it to be pointing at any other joints. So you'll see if I drop this joint in, it might be kind of hard to see, but you'll see if I drop in a new joint with that selected, it rotated itself to point to it. So that's normally okay, but in this case, we don't want that. So I'm going to go ahead and deselect this joint. If you guys can't see your joints, you can go into View, or is it Shading? Okay, Shading, sorry. Shading, X-ray joints. And what that'll do is it'll show your joints through your geometry. And the reason why I didn't know where that was is because I usually just press this button right here, which is X-ray joints. There's the X-ray options, which let you see through things. And if we want, we can turn that on if it makes it easier to see those joints too. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to build, we placed our base joint. And if we were building a more complex character, we would go through this a little bit more. But generally speaking, you kind of want to break your character up into chains, right? So essentially, and when I do this, I think this is how I think of it. I think of everything as a limb, right? I think of an arm as a limb. I think of the torso as a limb. I think of the legs as a limb. I even think of like the fingers as limbs, right? They're separate, like kind of little branches that come off the main structure. And so I kind of treat them all separately, and then I bring them back together. Okay, so we really only have one type of limb, which is just the legs. And it's going to be really simple, but I usually build them separately and then I come back to them. So we're going to go ahead and do the legs. So we're going to do this a little different. If the legs were straight up and down, we could do it from this front view. But when we build our IK system, the fact that this leg is like a little crooked, so I'm just accentuating it, but it's like a little crooked, which means like the geometry, which means that the IK system is going to be really funky. So what we're going to do is, just for the purposes of this, we're going to build this out straight, and then we're going to rotate into position. So I'm putting my thigh joint. So this is going to be where we're connecting to our hips, right? So think of, remember, each of these joints is going to be at an area of articulation. If I'm rotating my legs, I can rotate it from my hips. I can rotate it from my knee. I can rotate it from my ankle. So we're going to have 3 major joints. Okay? So I'll do this from the side. So I'm going to hold Shift, right? We'll just try doing, actually, I guess from the side, you don't even need to do Shift, but sometimes you can see how I can go left and right. Over here, I can hold Shift while I'm doing it. Okay, if you start clicking and dragging and then hold Shift, you can kind of straighten out the joint. We're just going to do this from the side. So I have my thigh, and that looks good. and I might want to go to the perspective view and just make sure that feels like it's in the center of that sphere from all angles, right? So maybe I might want to move it forward a little bit. It's a little hard to tell. Okay, we're going to come back to the side view, and we can go ahead and turn that X-ray on. And then I'm going to go ahead and select that create joint tool. I want this to be automatically parented to the thigh, the next joint I'm going to create, but we're going to place the knee. So I'm going to place the knee, and I'm going to put it a little bit forward. So it's going to put kind of more or less in center of mass of this knee joint right here. Let's place it, but it's a little bit forward. You'll see it kind of comes forward a little bit, and then we're going to go back again. So we're going to come down to the ankle, and I'm just going to try to get this as much as I can in the center of the ankle. If you don't like the size of these joints, what you can do is you can select them and hold Shift, click to select these. So I'll select the first one, Shift, click, just like all three of them. And I can come over to the channel box. There's a radius value. And we can set that to a lower value, like 0.2. Sometimes that's easier to see actually where the joint is instead of when it's, super massive. Okay. So this is pretty good. I think I really just want these joints to be in the middle of these areas of articulation. So knee, that looks pretty good. And then the thigh looks pretty good too. So I come back to the front view. Problem is, this is not actually really in these pieces, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to the thigh, and I'm going to go ahead and rotate it into where that, so that the ankle is kind of more or less in place. And the main thing is I'm trying not to get this knee crooked, right, from in the joint chain, right? Even though the knee technically should be a little bit more over here, I'm going to try not to do that just because it's going to make the IK system a little funky. And we don't have to worry about that too much. And I'm trying to avoid getting into the technical parts of this too much, because I know this is, for some of you guys, if you guys have never done this kind of stuff before, this might be like really like, what are we doing? So I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. We got a question. How are you shifting between panels? Oh, good question. Sorry about that, guys. So if you come in here and you press spacebar, you can switch between panels. So if I hover over a panel and press spacebar, I'll full screen it, and then I press spacebar, it goes back. If it's not doing that, then you just got to make sure you're in 4-panel layout mode, which is over here. You just click on the little 4-panel layout button. Good question. Sorry, I didn't go over that part. So I'm just pressing spacebar to jump back and forth. Okay, so let's go to this view. And so I like to check my work in the perspective view, and it looks pretty good, right? It looks pretty accurate. The fact that I'm working it from front and side view is going to guarantee that it's pretty decent. Like it's not, everything's going to be in the right position, but it's always a good idea to check it out in the 3D view. Let's go ahead and turn that X-ray on, so the geometry is kind of out of the way a little bit. And the joints, they get, by default, they're a little hard to see sometimes. So we have a leg, and we can test it out, right? I'm just going to rotate it. We're not going to build in the control system for this. Well, we'll see. I don't think we are going to, though. But I'm going to go ahead and also add in a joint here for the ball of the foot. So the ball of your feet are right here. This is your heel. This is the ball of feet. And then we have our toe. And I'm just going to hold shift to keep that from like going up and down. And that's just kind of like, even though this is going to be rotating toes, this is what's called an end joint. And an end joint, let's go ahead and put it over here, is essentially just a joint that's at the end of your joint chain that is going to guarantee that the end joint is facing the right way, right? If I put it up here, it's rotating that way. If I put it down here, it's rotating that way. So it just forces a particular joint to face this particular direction. That's what's called an end joint. And so we're just going to place that right here. So I'm going to select both of these guys. Oops, actually, that wasn't very good. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate it. I just selected the joint, press Control D because I kind of messed up. And then I'm going to, if I want to parent it, I just go ahead and select the child, select the parent, press P. I want to like manually parent these, right? Because remember, the create joint tool is going to parent things together. Oh, let me go also scale these guys down. So I'm going to select these guys, set the radius to 2 so you guys can see that better. So, and also I could set that in the create joint tool. If I come to skeleton, create joint. If I come over here, there's the radius sizes, and you can just you can fix the sizes to be a very particular size. So I might set this 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2. And so I think 2 is it 0.2 or 2? Okay, let's see what it looks like. Okay, cool. So it's just going to default the size to that size that I set it to. And that was just the create joint tool tool settings. So anyways, so if I wanted to, I can, the create joint tool is going to automatically parent everything for me. But if I lay out these joints separately without them connected, I can always just manually parent them together by just selecting the child, selecting the parent, and pressing P. So we're going to go ahead and connect this ball. So this would give us the ability to move this front part of the foot, right? Which is very common. Like if you think about when you're walking and your toes and like the essentially the knuckles of your feet are like on the ground as you lift your heel up when you're about to take a step, right? This is kind of like very common. We have this ball of the foot. And we're going to go ahead and parent this to our ankle. Okay. So the problem I'm already seeing is that this ankle, we dropped this in, but that ball of the foot and the toe are not lined up with the, let's go ahead and make sure we select just the ball of the foot. If I select both of them, you'll notice, what's the toe doing? Why is it doing that? That's because it's receiving double transformations, right? Because I'm selecting its parent and I'm selecting it. So the parent's moving it and I'm moving it. So it's getting twice as many transformation values, right? So here though, if I just select the parent and move it, you'll see it moves the child because the child is parented to that. All these words are probably going to just jumble together and be meaningless after a while for some people. Not to speak to anybody's intelligence, but just because the stuff is really complicated. Okay, so I just kind of move that back into the foot. So that looks pretty decent. All right, so now we have a ankle, right? So that's going to rotate the entire foot. We have the ball of the foot joint. We have our knee joint. And we have our thigh joint. So that's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and name these. So naming is really important and what I might do is I might see freeze rotation. Can I do that? Yeah, okay. So one thing to keep in mind is, well, okay. First thing I want to say is we'll come up to this thigh. Remember how I had to rotate it into position, right? So it was straight and then I rotated in. Generally speaking, when you're doing rigging, you don't want your joints to actually have rotation values. You only want the rotation values to come in when you're animating. So I rotated this into place. So this joint actually has rotation values on it, which isn't good. We want to get rid of that. So I'm going to right click on this and say freeze, rotate. You can't freeze translations. It's a little confusing, but the translation values are always going to be there on joints, even though on geometry we can freeze them. But we do want to get rid of all of our rotation values on our joints. So I would just double check my joints and make sure none of them have any rotate values on them. If they do, I just go ahead and right click their rotate values and say freeze rotations so that they have zeroed out rotations. Okay. All right. So now we need to name these because it's really important to, you'll notice this isn't a lot. You probably saw it on my other rig if you looked in the outliner. And it wasn't even a very complicated rig, but as you go, it's kind of like programming where you just get this wall of text and it gets really confusing. So I'm going to go ahead and name these. So this one right here is going to be called my base joint. So I use base _ JNT for joint. Let me go ahead and docs.google.com. Just create a blank doc. Okay, and then I'm just going to make this big enough for you guys to see. Base, or I'll do something like base _ JNT for joints. Okay. If I'm doing right and left, what I'll do is like, let's say thigh, or I'll probably say something like upper leg _ R _ JNT, which means that this is the upper leg joint and it's the right one. So it's just like different ways that you guys can, this is very good to have a naming convention and being consistent with it because it's going to make it, one, easier for you to navigate. So you're going to be able to look through your whole structure and at a glance, you can be like, okay, that's upper leg joint, easy, right? Instead of clicking on it and be like, what's this joint? Joint 32, which one is this one? The other thing is it also makes it easy for if you want to use scripting to make things go faster, right? You guys might think to yourself, I'm not really interested in programming, so scripting is, I don't need to worry about that ever, so I'm not going to worry about that. But even if you're not someone who would consider yourself like a programmer or a technical artist, like even when I was an undergrad, I was like, yeah, I'm not going to be a programmer. But I was using scripts whenever I could because they can speed up your workflow. And they might seem a little daunting at first, but you can usually just download a bunch of really easy scripts and copy paste them. And if you have a good naming structure, you can actually select certain things. Like if you use this _r_, you can go through and select all of your joints on the right side really easily, or all of your pieces that are on the right side. And you can easily change things very quickly without having to do, manual selection. Because you're going to get a bunch of, your rig is going to be made up of like 100 different components with like a full character. Okay, so naming convention is super important. I like to do this too. Is like if I have a group, a lot of times I'll call this like character _grp, or the geometry I'll do like character _geo. If I do controls, I'll do like right, or I wouldn't say right, like I'd say like a elbow _r_ctrl for control. What other ones? I think that's pretty much the ones I use all the time is groups, geo for geometry, controls, joints. Okay, so we'll come back in here. So I did base _joint, and this one's going to be my, this one's going to be like upper leg _, and this is the left side of the character. So it's the character's left, not screen left, _L _JNT. Okay. And we can copy paste that if we want to. I can copy that down to the knee, and I'm just going to replace the upper leg part with the word knee. And then we're going to do, now we're down to the ankle. We'll just copy paste that one. And this one's going to be called ankle _L _JNT. And this one's going to be called, I just call this like football. I like the ball of the foot. And then we'll call this one, you can call it toe joint if you want to. A lot of times I'll define these joints that are not actually like where I'm going to be animating the character as end joints. So I'll call it like football _L _END for end, like end joint. But that's not really super important for you guys. You guys don't have to worry about that too much. You guys can call it what you want. All right, so we've named this. So we want to name it as we go along. You don't want to name it at the end because you're going to have too much stuff and you're going to be really frustrated. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and parent this back to my base, right? Because my base is going to move my whole character, right? And I want my legs to move around whenever I move the character, right? If I move the whole character over here, right, those legs got to come along with it, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this thigh or this upper leg, and then I'm going to select the joint, the base joint, and I'm going to press P for parent. Okay. And let's go ahead and hide that geometry. So there's what our basic joint structure looks like. So it's a very simple joint structure. Let's go ahead and rename this layer as geo, just so we know. Okay. So I'm going to do the other side, but we're going to automate the process. So it's now that I've parented to the base joint, what I can do is I can select this top of my joint structure. We're going to come over to skeleton, mirror joints. I'm going to open up the tool settings for that. We're going to mirror it across the YZ plane, which means that it's going to mirror, it's kind of confusing, but it's like, imagine that there is a, up is Y and Z is forward and back. The YZ plane is essentially a plane right here. So if you're mirroring across it, it should just be mirror across the X axis. I don't know why they say it like this, but it's mirroring from this side to this side. So we're going to select the YZ plane. Okay. I'm going to select that top joint. I'm going to search for the word. So this also has an automated naming system. So we're going to replace, we want the same names, but we want to replace the L with R for right side, right? So I'm going to search for _L_. I'm going to replace it with _R_. Okay. Now when I click apply, you'll see it duplicated and mirrored across my joint structure, and it renamed them with R instead of L. So it's super handy. All right, so we have both our left leg and our right leg. So next step is debatable. It really depends on how you like to work, but I like to go ahead and just bind my geometry to my joints, and I can kind of start playing around and testing my joints. Got a chat message. Where did you go to get that mirror tab? That's under skeleton. So it's skeleton, mirror joints. And I'll just bring you that thing up. And I'm opening up the tool settings for it. Yep, no problem. Well, okay, we have one more thing that we have to do. I personally, even though this is a very simple character, I want to move the head independent of the hips. You don't have to, but I kind of want to. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to that 4-panel layout, and I'm just going to drop in one more joint right around here. And it's going to be right above the base joint. It's going to be a little confusing looking because it's like almost right on top of the base joint. But this will let me keep the hips static and in place and let me rotate the head and move it around. So I'm just going to drop a joint chain somewhere in here, wherever I think I want the head to rotate around, right? Because keep in mind, if I do it like this, let's go ahead and make this unreferenced. And I'm just going to parent this really quickly just so you guys can see it. If my joint's back here, I want to rotate back here. If my joint is over here, and this is not how we're going to bind it, this is just how I'm doing it. If my joint's right here, it's going to rotate right there. So your joint placement is very important because it's going to determine, where your object or that piece of geometry is going to bend around. So I like to, you got to think about where it's going to connect. And so in my case, I want this joint to be kind of right here, right? Because I want this top part to rotate around the center area right here, somewhere around the hips, even though this isn't a very realistic character. So that's a good spot, I think. Okay, so we'll come back out here, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure I name that joint. So that joint's going to be named head joint, head underscore JNT. And I'm going to parent it underneath the root joint. So I'm just going to select the head joint, then the root joint, press P. So now when I move that root joint, all of my joints are moving together. So that root joint's going to be your base. It's going to move everything else. And then I can move my legs separately, and I can move that head separately. Okay, and if I wanted to, I could have done an end joint. And let's just do that just to be consistent. And I'll just go ahead and grab this guy, hold shift, or click and drag and hold shift, like that. Okay. And now we have an end joint. So it's really, and we'll just call that one head underscore END. Not that it particularly matters, to be honest, for this character. All right. So, but that way, at least you guys can see like the head, how it's going to rotate. Just gives you kind of like a handy visualization. Okay. So now we're going to go bind our skin to our joints. So I want to go ahead and unreference my geometry so I can select it. And we're going to select the geometry, and let's go ahead and go to, I'll turn X-ray off. And so we're just going to select our geometry, and we're going to select the joint that's going to control it. So what we're doing here is we're doing what's called a rigid bind. Let me go ahead and save scene as the cube progress. Okay. And let's see if I think I'll have to download the file from where you guys download it. In class working demo. So because I don't want to get into going over everything because it's just not enough time in class, and we're already going to be running out of time. But let's go down to in class rigging demo 1, continue. Yeah, I don't care. I know. So I put this in here in the interest if we actually had time. But this is a deformable object. So we have a arm, right? Arm geometry. And it's bound to these 3 joints. So if I rotate these joints, you'll see that just like it was on all of our other characters and on that skeleton, each joint is moving a piece of geometry. But the difference is with this skeleton and with our walking cube is that all of these pieces are kind of like a robot piece, right? You can think of them as if they're like stone or metal, like they're not going to bend, right? They're all kind of separate from each other, right? Kind of like pretend this whole thing was made of wood, right? Carved wood, right? It's not going to bend. But a lot of characters have deformable geometry, like it's like a single piece that's going to actually bend and change shape. So you'll see when I rotate the elbow, right, because the upper arm and lower arm are actually connected, that area they're connected at, it's going to change and bend, right? This is using what's called skinning or weight painting. Let me go ahead and show you guys how to do a bind with this really quickly, and we'll go back to our character in a second, but I want to show you what this typically looks like. If I select this and I'm going to go ahead and do skin, unbind skin. Oh, okay, you know what? That might not work. All right, so normally when you do this, I don't want to have to clean that up. We would go in and we do bind skin. and we would bind it to our joint hierarchy, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But when I bind it, what it does is with the default settings, and let's go ahead and turn on the screen space anti-aliasing so you guys can, it's not so crazy. If I come in here, if I select that geometry, actually, let me go ahead and set a keyframe for this. So from here to here, I'm just going to have that animate, should animate. Nope, okay, why did it do that? That was weird. Okay. So we're just going to go here, and we'll key select it. I know there's something, what? And this one should be 0. Okay. Okay. This is something I did not predict. I have definitely done something with my animation or keyframe settings where it's like replacing all of the keyframes. All right, so you know what? Let's not worry about the animation. That's definitely a problem that I'll have to fix later on. But, delete. And I have no idea why this is opening. Okay. So, right, we have this kind of soft deformation. You can see also when I rotate this elbow, it's kind of affecting up here. So I'm going to select this. I'm going to go to weight painting, which you can find underneath skin. And again, we're not going to be doing this in this class just because, one, it's a little tedious, and two, it's just another thing that we kind of have to go over, which is a bit, kind of a lot, but we're going to go here. And I'm going to go ahead and open the tool settings. We'll just click on this, close the outliner. And so what this does is it shows me a list of all the joints that this arm is bound to. This arm is actually being influenced by all 4 of these joints, right? And so normally, if we're doing kind of the mannequin structure, right, this is really easy, right? Because each piece of geometry is only bound to a single joint, right? So that whole joint is controlling it 100%. But if you have a single piece of geometry that's actually being bound to multiple joints, we have to define to the system which joint is controlling which part of the geometry, right? It might seem obvious to us, but the computer doesn't know. The computer doesn't know this joint right here is supposed to be controlling all of this, right? So we have to define it. It has a lot of cool tools that'll automate the process and make it simpler. But generally speaking, we have to kind of define, okay, these vertices right here are going to be bound to, let's call these this one, I did not name this, which is a bad move on my part. This one's going to be called wrist, and this one's going to be called shoulder. Okay. So when I rotate the shoulder, I want all these guys to move. When I rotate the elbow, I want all these guys to move. Okay. There's something going on with this file. Oh, I guess it's because I renamed those, but it went. That's annoying. Okay. Sorry. Shoulder, elbow. I think it disconnected the name between these 2 systems. Okay. All right. So I'll come back over here. Weight painting. So we got shoulder, elbow, wrist. And so this is just, this is called weight painting. This is where we're painting weights, or we're essentially saying which joint is affecting which part of the geometry. And I'm going to use the color ramp mode instead of the black to white, mostly because black to white I think is a little confusing. So you can see here we have our, it's showing as a heat map where red and then white are this joint is completely controlling this area. And blue and black means this joint that I have currently selected, which is the, let's come up here, the wrist, right? The wrist isn't controlling any of these guys up here, which is correct. But I've come over to elbow. We noticed that earlier it was kind of moving the shoulder area up here a little bit. And you can see it's kind of stealing a lot of weight from the thumb, right? And if I come in over here and rotate the wrist, you'll see that you can it's kind of hard to tell, but you'll probably start to see that the wrist or the thumb is maybe a little bit kind of deforming weird, right? So you can see right there, you see how that thumb is kind of flattening right there, kind of weird. And that's because the wrist has control over that area, right? So even though I'm rotating the wrist joint, those vertices are kind of staying behind because they think they're supposed to be only obeying the elbow joint, not the wrist joint. We're not going to get too far into this, and I feel like I'm already kind of talking circles. But what we can do is we can come in here and let's say I'm going to go to this wrist joint. I'm going to go ahead and use my painting values, and we're just going to replace with the value of 1. So I'll just come in here, and I'll just come in and just start painting this so that all of the hand is being controlled by the wrist, right? And it's not being controlled by anything else. I can just come in here and just grab that. Oh, I probably did too much right there. Let's go right there, go right there. I'm just trying to show this as a quick example. So I'll come in here, and now when I rotate that wrist joint, we'll have a harsher fall off on the wrist, right? So you can see there's more of like a bend there, but that thumb isn't actually deforming now. And same thing with the elbow, right? When we rotate this, it gets a little gooey right here, and that's because the elbow is kind of rotating and controlling a bit of the upper arm, and the upper arm is controlling and rotating a little bit of the lower arm. So what we can do is we can come in here, come to that weight painting. I'm going to go to the, sorry, I'm just double checking these guys. Okay, we'll come to the elbow. Actually, let's do the shoulder. Replace the value of 1, and I'm just going to come in here and just replace these guys. And I might come down to the elbow, and I'm just giving it like a little bit of a harder fall off right there. Because you can see where it's green, it's like shared between the upper arm and the lower arm, right? So there's like a blend between upper arm and lower arm. And so it's a very broad kind of area it's covering, which is causing that kind of gooey structure. So if I come in here and just make that a little bit tighter and less of that green in that middle area, then that deformation is going to be less soft in that elbow area, right? So you can see where before, like this was all bending in whenever I rotated the elbow. Now that upper part's not really moving at all, right? Because I've painted it off so that these vertices up here are being controlled almost 100% by this guy and not sharing any control with the elbow. If that's confusing, I'm not surprised because I think a lot of people get kind of confused by weight painting. It's not like super obvious all the time, but I just want to cover that because we're not going to do weight painting on this character. But I kind of want to show you what the standard kind of way of skinning or binding joints to a piece of geometry is. We're going to be using what's called rigid binding, which means that there's not multiple joints assigned to each piece of geometry, but just a single joint. And it makes it a lot easier, right? Because you don't have to define like this joint, that elbow joint is moving this vertice, and then the shoulder joint is moving this vertice. Like you guys don't have to worry about that. We're just saying like all these joints on this piece of geometry are being controlled by a single, or all of these vertices are being controlled by a single joint. All right. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and let's just start with the leg. So when I rotate this right here, I want this part right here. And I think for me, I also want this part right here to also move with it, right? This isn't going to work how I'm rotating it right now, but essentially I can just pair this really quickly and you'll see. So I'll select this and I'll just move this. Don't do what I'm doing. I'm just kind of showing you guys. I kind of want it to rotate like this when I rotate that thigh joint. So I'm just going to Control Z that back. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and select the thigh joint. I'm going to go ahead and select the the thigh geometry and the knee geometry. And I'm going to come over to skin. And we're going to open up the settings for this bind skin. And so in here, really, because we're doing a really simple bind, you guys don't have to worry about a lot of these settings. And we're not getting into weight painting, thank God, because I hate talking about it. We're going to come over to bind to, and we're going to change this to selected joints because we only have a single joint. If I do joint hierarchy, what it's going to do is it's going to bind. Let me just show you guys what that looks like. Click apply. What it's going to do is it's going to bind the joint hierarchy of my selected joint. So it's going to, the hierarchy of this joint is the thigh, the knee, the ankle, and et cetera, right? Because this is the kind of relationship between all of these guys. You know, it's child-parent relationship between all these guys is its hierarchy, right? So that means that the knee is bending it. The ankle probably isn't really influencing anything up there because it's too far away. But they're all considered part of the binding, which is, you know, it might be okay. Honestly, this isn't too bad, but we're going to do something else. We're going to go ahead and do, okay, cool. I just want to make sure it wasn't bound. So I'm going to select this, select the thigh. We're going to do selected joints. So it's only going to bind our geometry to the joint we have selected, which is that one. And I click apply. Now, when I rotate this, that looks good. But when I rotate the knee, it doesn't move the knee, and that's, or any of this geometry, so that's great. So this is what our rigid bind is. Or this is what's called rigid binding. It means that we're only binding our geometry to a single joint. So now I want to select the ankle and the it sounds weird. You might expect like I would want to bind. It really doesn't matter. You guys can do this too. You can bind this joint to this ankle, and you could bind the knee to the knee joint instead of binding it up to the upper thigh. But for the simplicity's sake, or for what I like to do just for this case, you don't really have to get into explanations, but I'm just going to bind this ankle and this lower leg to the knee joint. Oops. So select that knee joint, and I'll go ahead and click apply. Or I could just close that and just do the, or it's just, well, let's just keep that. There's also a bind skin button right here, but we'll just keep that open. So now when I rotate the knee, that moves, and that's nice. Rotate the thigh, that moves. That's nice. Cool. All right. And then let's go ahead and bind this guy to the ankle joint. So I'll go ahead and click up. And we can maybe do the center part here too. Apply. So now when I rotate this ankle, the foot, that part of the foot moves. And we're going to bind this guy right here to this balled foot joint. So click apply. And so now when I rotate that, it rotates the ball of foot. All right, so this is looking pretty good, right? Moving our knee, moves all the stuff below the knee, moves the thigh, moves all the stuff below the thigh. That looks great. Okay, so we're gonna have to do the same thing on the other side. So I'm just gonna go through this pretty quickly. I can't remember if I wrote, I didn't add that main ball to the thigh joint, so that's good. I'm fine with that. So I'll select the knee and the thigh, grab that thigh joint, click apply. Grab the ankle geometry and the lower leg geometry, and then select the knee, click apply, and I'm going to select the foot, that middle piece, bind it to the ankle, and I'll select the ball or the front of the foot and then the ball joint and click apply. Same thing as I did on the other side, just on the other joints. And you just test it out whenever you're done. Okay, that all looks good. And we want to make sure we are undoing our rotations so that we still, again, have no rotation values. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and bind the big thigh balls. Sounds really weird. And then the waist underwear shape to the root joint. So we have our base joint, whatever you want to call it. Click apply. And then we're going to bind our head to our head joint. Click apply. Okay, so now when I rotate this guy, right, I can move this. When I move the base or root joint, it's going to move everything. And then when I rotate these thighs, it rotates the legs. Cool. So it's a really basic structure. And we've already built a system, and all we did was just bound the right geometry to it. If you feel like you bound the wrong geometry, you just select the geometry, you go to skin, unbind skin. And that's just going to remove the influence of that joint on that piece of geometry. Then you can rebind it with the bind skin options. And remember, when you're doing this, if you want to do this rigid bind, we're doing it to selected joints, not to joint hierarchy. Okay. All right. So with that in place, now we can start putting in our control system because we have our joints controlling our geometry. So we have our skeleton, we have the underlying structure. Now we need to build out our control system. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys like the first thing. We're just going to kind of start building first controls, and then we'll go into the movement system in a second. So in order to build a control, I like to use curves. And so I'll come in here and we're just using really basic curves. We're just going to use a nerve circle most of the time. Okay. So the first one I want to do is, just for simplicity's sake, we're going to do the head. Okay. So for the head, what I'm going to do is we can hide the geometry so we can see the skeleton. I want this head control to move the head joint. So I'm going to go ahead and come up to, let me think about this for a second. Yeah, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, actually, let's do the hips. So the hips, we're going to hold V to snap, or you can click on the little snap to point button. I want to snap it to the center of this joint right here. So there's a couple things we're going to have to keep in mind with controls is that first, what's really important is that our control system, our controls are one, centered on our joints so that they have the same rotation point as our joint, right? So that it's, this is the rotation position, right? And let me go ahead and press plus, so that's a little bit bigger. And if I select that control, it's the same exact spot. That is very important, right? And let me show you why. Let's do it on the, I'll make this the head control. We'll just go ahead and jump to that, right? So when I rotate this, and let's go ahead and show the geometry again. When I rotate this, that head joint is, rotating around that joint position. Let's go ahead and put this control into the wrong spot. So what we're going to do is we're essentially going to be doing, so we're definitely going to I'm going to have to follow up with a video afterwards because we're not going to be able to talk about everything before, or finish this before the end of class. But if I come in here, and don't worry about the constraints right for a second, we'll talk about it in a second. But if I rotate, this control, which is rotating the joint, you can see because you see where this control's pivot point is, it's not the same as the joint, which means that the joint's not rotating, it's actually moving through space. It's also rotating, but it's also moving. We don't really want our joints to move, we just want our joints to rotate. Let me control Z, go back down to here, let's scale that up. And so now when I come here and go to constraint, parent constraint, if I select this, now you can see because the pivot point of the control is the same as the pivot point of the joint, right? That joint's not going to move. So that's one thing that we got to keep in mind is we want our controls to have the same exact pivot point as our joints. Okay? What's cool about this is we can always, my control can technically like be up here. Right? Let's go ahead and scale it up like that. But I could go ahead and move my pivot point down to that joint, right? So I can, by editing the pivot point by pressing V and snapping it down with the V key down onto that joint, right? Visually it can be right there, which might be a little bit easier to see, but it's still pivoting down here on that joint. So we'll take advantage of that at some point. Anyways, okay, so this one was, I wanted it to be the hip control. So I'm just going to go ahead and select that joint, hold V, snap it to my root joint. Okay, we're going to go ahead and rename this, and I'm going to call this hip_CTRL. Okay. And we're going to go ahead and show the geometry. Okay, there we go. Show the geometry. Let's go ahead and make some more controls. I'm going to make the head control. So we're just going to go ahead and select this joint, duplicate it. I'm going to hold V to snap it to that joint. You'll have to be careful. If you have the geometry visible, you have to be careful because snapping will either try to snap to your geometry or the joint. And so you might think you snap it to the joint, but it's actually like somewhere else. So just keep in mind, or you can hide your geometry. It makes it a lot easier. Okay. And I might, because I don't really like how close that is to the hips, I'm just going to go ahead and move this up, scale it up a little bit. This will be the head control. And you can change the shape of it. We'll worry about that later. And I'll just press V to edit my pivot point, hold V on my keyboard to snap to joint, and I'm going to snap it down to the head. Okay, so this one's going to control the head joint. Okay, now before, okay, let's talk about constraints. All right, so in order to get these controls to control the joint, normally if we want like one object to control another object, right, we use parent-child relationship, right? We make it the parent, the thing that we want to control the other thing, the parent of that thing, right? So if I want this joint to control this joint, I make this joint the parent of that joint, which is what currently is working, right? If I come in here, that head joint is the parent of the end joint. So the problem is with rigging, we want our joints to stay parented to each other, right? We want them to be in like a little kind of, we want them all to be related to each other, right? But our controls also need to control the joints or move the joints, right? And so the problem is if I was doing parenting, if I came in here and parented it to this control, that joint, that head joint is no longer underneath my skeleton, right? It's actually underneath the control. So it's breaking my skeleton. Without getting into too much detail about it, you just generally don't want to do that, okay? So what we're going to do for this is we're actually going to be setting, we're going to be doing what's called a constraint. And so let me go ahead and show you guys again with that little demonstration of the ball, cube, and cone. Over here, we'll grab that cone. Oh yeah, that color is perfect because it's the exact same color as the background. Let's go over to Lambert's. Just make that darker. There we go. All right, I'll scale this down. And I think this is different than what I had before, but that's okay. Oh, that's goofy. All right. So remember, when we were doing parenting, we just would parent select the child, select the parent, press P, and then, when I rotate the parent, it rotates the child. Okay. We have something else that does the exact same thing, but doesn't break or doesn't actually require them to actually be parented. And this is, so remember, parent-child relationship is what's called true hierarchy, right? We're actually setting in stone, this thing is in control of this thing, or this thing is the parent of this thing. But we're going to do what I consider fake hierarchy, and it's called constraining our objects. So if you go to the rigging tab, there's this constrain button, and it's going to essentially make things so that they're not actually parented to each other, but they're going to behave like they are. Okay. So the one that we're really going to be worrying about is the parent constraint. And so if I select the parent, then the child, it's weird. It's really confusing because it's actually backwards of, if you want to do a parent-child relationship, you select the child first, then the parent. If you want to do a parent constraint, you select the parent first, then the child. Don't worry, you're going to mess it up at some point, and you'll just have to undo it and redo it. It's no big deal. So we'll select our parent, then our child. We're going to go to constraint. I'm going to open up this settings for it right here. And I'm just going to make sure this says maintain offset. Let me show you what that looks like when I say don't. When I click apply, you'll be like, what happened? Oh, why did the cube move to the center of the sphere? What that does is when we set up this constraint, what it does is if I look at these guys, right, this guy has, translate x3, and this guy has translate x0, right? If I keep maintain offset off and click apply, it's going to try to copy, the cube is going to try to copy whatever the sphere is, right? It keeps the same translation values, right? So just keep that in mind. It's useful in a lot of cases, but in this case, we don't want it. But what it does is essentially, if you don't have maintain offset turned on, it tries to make the child copy the parent like completely. Like it does it copies all the values of the parent. If we click on maintain offset, I'll go ahead and select that parent and then select the child, click apply. What it does is it connects them, right? You can see these turned blue, which means there's a connection coming into the cube. So it connects them, but it maintains their offset. It maintains the fact that it's its own person and it has its own values. So if I come in here, you'll see that sphere and that cube actually aren't parented underneath each other. Even though now when I rotate that cube, that sphere, that cube is going to behave as if it is the child, even though it technically isn't. So that's what a constraint does, is it kind of creates this relationship between two objects without actually making it true, right? It doesn't actually have to parent them or change the hierarchy at all in the outliner. If you look at the child, though, you will notice there's this little thing called the constraint underneath it. So if you ever want to get rid of it, you just can come in here and you can just delete that constraint to remove that constraint. So it's essentially tying these guys together without directly parenting them together. There's a bunch of other ones. So there's you can see in here, there's a point, orient, and scale. Let me go ahead and show you what that looks like. So normally with like a parenting, if I like, let's just grab this and parent this. If I do a parent, if I rotate, scale, and move it, right, that child's going to do exactly the same thing. Right? It's going to also scale. All the constraints, and we're not going to get into all of them, they all behave a little differently, right? So if I select the parent and the child, do constraint, and then do scale, what it does is it's not going to move with it, it's not going to rotate with it, but it's also going to scale when it scales, right? So they all do something a little bit different. Aim constraint's interesting. That's probably one of the more unique ones. If I select the parent and the child, and I do constraint, aim constraint, what it does is it's going to orient itself to always look at that object, right? So in this case, it's always kind of like you pretend this is a little face right here. It's always rotating, so it's keeping that cube that it's constrained to in view. But we're not going to worry about that. So let's just go and get rid of all this. All right. So we're going to constrain these joints to these controls so that we can move the joints with the controls without unparenting all these joints from each other. So I'm going to start with the head. So I'm going to go ahead and select the control and then the head joint. And there's something wrong here that we're going to see, but I'm going to do it first. Then we're going to go ahead and parent constrain it so that when I rotate this, right, now that joint's moving whenever I rotate that control, which is awesome. That's what I want. So here's the problem that we're running into. I did not freeze my transform values on this control before I bound them. And we didn't talk about this before, but generally speaking, on your controls, you want them to be zeroed out, because if I'm animating, let's pretend I'm animating and I'm like, oh, let's go ahead and put it into this pose so he's looking down at the floor. And I'm like, okay, now I want to actually return him back to his neutral position. Let me go ahead and set these to 0. Oh, and set this to 1. Oh, okay, what happened, right? So what happened is that this is considered its neutral position, right? This is where we want our character to be in their default pose, but my control is not set to its neutral or default position. It has a pose to it. So remember I had mentioned earlier that when we were looking at the geometry, that if the translate and rotation values are non-zero and the scale values are not 1, then what it's telling Maya is, hey, this is not in its default position. It has transformations on it. So this is really just important for animation in the sense that if these are not set to 0, then the animator has a hard time going back to the neutral position for your character, right? If I'm animating your rig and I'm like, oh crap, okay, so this control needs to be 5 high in the Y, 0.097 in the Z, and it needs to be scaled to 2.47. Okay, so now I have to write it down so that if I want to go back to its default position, oops, if I go in here and like, let's say like, okay, I want to rotate it. Okay, I want to go back to the default position. I have to be like, okay, 0 was 0, X was, I already forgot what it was. It was something, Z was something, rotation was something. Actually, I think the translate Z's were fine. Actually, I think the rotates were fine too. Actually, this is a really bad example because in this case, it's just the rotate values. But let's say I was moving it around. That's probably better. Let's say I was moving it around and I wanted to get back to that default height, right? I'd be like, oh crap, I can't remember. It's like 5 point something and then like 0.097, right? So anyways, I didn't set this up very well to demonstrate. It's not really optimized for easy animation. So what we want to do is before we constrain our controls to our joints, is we want to freeze them. So it's in the right position. I like it. I'm just going to come in here and freeze all on that control. So now once they're frozen, I can go ahead and select that control, then select that joint, and then I can go ahead and do my parent constraint to create a connection between them. Okay? And now since those values were 0, I can move this and scale it and change whatever I want. The scale's not really going to do anything with parent constraint. And then if I wanted to go back to its neutral position, I just go in here, select all those values and type in 0, and it goes back to its default position. So yeah, it's really important to be able to do this. So same thing with the hips. I'm just going to go ahead and select this and I'm going to freeze all. And then we're just going to select the hip control. We're going to select the root joint or base joint. And we're just going to do constraint, parent constraint. Okay. And this is going to move all the lower body. And I'm going to create one more control for now. And I don't think we're going to be able to, we'll probably have to stop after this one. And then I'll cover in a separate video that I release and send to you guys to finish this off, the leg system. Because we haven't gotten to the meat of this yet, which is moving those legs, which is very particular. So we're going to create what's called the base or root joint. And I'll just call this one underscore or root underscore JNT. Okay. And this is going to move this joint is supposed to move our whole entire character together, right? And so what's going to happen is all of our joints. So this one, let me make sure I call this one head joint, head underscore JNT. Oh no, not I've been saying JNT. I meant control. CTRL. Head control. Not the head joint. It's not the root joint. This is the root control. Okay. Or you can call it master control. So we're just going to select both of these guys. And I probably, if I move this around, I probably want the head to move with it. So we're going to go ahead and select the parents, this head control underneath the hip control. And then parent it. Oop. So that when I move the hip control, it's going to move the head too. And we're going to go ahead and parent the hip control underneath the root control. It might seem kind of like redundant, like this one moves the entire rig. Why do we also need this one that moves the entire rig? But once these legs have their own controls, the hips and the upper body are going to be able to move independent of the feet. So this is kind of like future. It's something we're going to have to do in the future anyways. So we're just going to select the hip control, then the root control as parent. And now when I move this root control, this is going to move and place my entire character rig throughout space. And let me go ahead and fast forward really quickly, but I'll show you guys in more detail slowly. So don't worry, I'm going really fast. When we do our skeleton, create IK handle, I select that, and then I can't parent that under that. All right, so if I build, and let me go ahead and turn off that X-ray mode. So if I build, once I build my leg system, right, I'll be able to move my upper body separately. So you can see that foot stays planted, right, which is going to be really handy for like crouching and doing like a walk and stuff like that. And then we'll just make sure all of our joints are underneath this master control so that we can move the whole rig together, but I can also move these guys different areas separately. But we'll worry about that later.